Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marion Walsh, and I'm a partner at Littman Krooks. We're a law firm which is dedicated to special needs planning, elder law, as well as special education department, which I am chair of. And we are going to be speaking today about the checklist for getting ready for back to school in this very difficult time of the ongoing pandemic and COVID-19 planning. I know some of you may have attended the last webinar, and at that point, the school districts had not come out with their plans yet. So this is generally such an exciting time at back to school, and the children are all getting ready. And right now, it's just filled with so much uncertainty and anxiety, and it's really unfortunate for everyone. But I'm here to give you sort of a guidepost on what to do and some steps to take, particularly for children with disabilities, and in general for any students as well. So the first step, I think, in getting ready for back to school, I have a checklist of about almost 30 items, which are, some are very small and detail oriented, some of them are larger. But I think in general, the first step is to do your general back to school preparation with your child, to get excited, buy supplies, of course, you may have to buy masks, buy everything that you usually would buy. Unless your child is completely remote, you may not need back to school wardrobe. But I think it's important to have that excitement about the back to school time as well as the preparation. I know, for example, this also covers a little bit of college planning. For my own son, who's going to be remote in college, I did buy him a big banner for his room with his college name so that he could feel like he is at a satellite campus rather than just being isolated. So there is that importance of the excitement and the preparation. Now, one of the most important things as parents to do is to review your school district reopening plan. And if you haven't done that, it's really important to do that and to make sure you understand it and review it in a lot of detail. It takes some time. Some of them are quite long, but make sure you understand it. Every school district had to have a reopening plan into the State Department of Education by July 31st. And some of them are listed still as draft plans, which is okay. They did have to be submitted, so they're not really draft. However, they are subject to change, as we all know, because things do change. Some districts may decide to switch from switch from a hybrid plan to remote. No district that I know of is coming back in full because they just don't have the capacity, but they are going to be coming back either as fully remote or a hybrid remote plan. I just forgot to mention one housekeeping matter. I will be taking questions as we go along to keep this interactive, and please use the chat box on Zoom to ask questions. I will be monitoring it. So everyone is muted, but please do use the chat box for any questions that come up as we go along. Okay. So look on your district website with the plan. Now, I think you should also compare it with the state reopening guidance, which I think asked you to review last time as well, which is the 146-page document that the state came out with. And every district's plan should conform with this New York State reopening, that's the State Education Department reopening guidance. So so we're already up to step 3, and make sure you ensure you understand that plan. Every district has to have meetings with stakeholders. That means with parents, with teachers, with community members, with students who are old enough to participate. So do attend those meetings virtually. Very few are going to be in person, but do give feedback to the decision makers, including the Board of Education and the superintendents in your district. Review the plan with your child at an age appropriate level. If there of course are going to be issues if your child is attending school in person, about wearing masks, about social distancing, and it's very important to explain what those rules are and what children have to do. If students are in person, as part of that buying supplies, make sure you get your child a mask that fits, more than one. School districts do have to provide masks if the children do not have them. Students who do attend in person are going to be required to wear masks and socially distance. If your child cannot wear a mask or is not physically able to keep it on, that is something to address with the school and with the IEP team. But in general, school districts are requiring students to wear masks and to socially distance. So it's important to review those procedures to the extent you can with your child in advance. And practice the mask wearing, again, explain it on an age appropriate level. And it's important to get ready for that before school, because that is going to be an important part of the process. Now, most school districts that do have reopening plans are going to be on a sort of a rotating schedule with different pods. So for example, some students go to school, one pod goes Monday, Wednesday, the students may be off on Wednesday, and then the other pod or group of students goes Thursday and Friday. Make sure you understand that schedule. Make sure your student understands the schedule. It can be very complicated, especially for when it gets to the high school level, but make sure you review that. And the guidance from the state does state that whether remote or hybrid, all students should have interaction and access with their teachers. So it's not enough for school districts just to hand out worksheets and not give students some real-time interaction with teachers. And make sure that your school district plan does contain social emotional resources and have a plan and have information on mental health and mental health concerns and how to address those, either for students with disabilities or not with disabilities or typical students, because that is an important part of the plan, which is required by the state to be addressed. So those are just some general steps for all students. All students that, sorry, I just had a, all students that have to do with the plan, both from New York State and your school district. If your school district does not have a plan, they are out of compliance, and I think almost every district in New York State does have them that I know of. Some districts have switched, for example, from a hybrid plan to a fully remote plan because they realized their plans were not ready, which is okay. So it just means there's more time to get ready. Now we're going to really focus on students with disabilities. And again, your school district plan should really have a specific section on students with disabilities. And if it doesn't, then please talk to your superintendent, make that part of the dialogue, because the state plan does list specific mandates for plans to contain for students with disabilities. It's not really enough for a school district plan just to say we provide free appropriate public education, to students with disabilities. And just some background on this, it is true that the guidance from New York State and from the federal government is still that school districts must ensure that students with disabilities receive their IEP services to the greatest extent possible. And that is also going to be true for any Section 504 accommodations as well. The guidance also states that school districts must prioritize high-need students for delivery of in-person services. Very important to note that. And we had some questions last time about the least restrictive environment and how we want to make sure that the school districts are delivering those services to high-need students in the least restrictive environment. Now, there is no guidance that requires school districts at this time to give in-person services at home for students. And one dilemma that comes up frequently and we have a question about is if your student is too medically fragile to attend school, for example, they may have a health condition, they may be too susceptible, can you ask that your school district require or provide in-person services at home? Thus far, there is no guidance that requires that, and most districts are not going to allow that necessarily because it will subject teachers to be or providers to be going into your home, and it's very difficult to comply with any socially distant mandates. That may change, and there is some information in the New York State Education Department guidance that does state that for students with who are medically fragile or have significant needs, they will evaluate those cases. Districts have to evaluate them on an individual basis. So it is possible to ask for that. The other option is to find a private provider to come into the home who may be more willing to, and then seek reimbursement from the school district, which is not a given necessarily, but you can at least seek the reimbursement. We're going to talk about the impartial hearing process a little bit later. So, so again, just for those who are just coming in, we are reviewing, we initially reviewed the guidance from New York State Education Department very briefly. And then we noted that every school district has to have a plan in general for reopening, make sure you review that. And we are now focusing on the specific needs for students with disabilities. And please use the chat button if you have any questions, and please feel free to interrupt because I'd like to make this interactive. So again, if your child really does need in-person services, it is likely they are going to have to be attending in school, and there will be some services available for most districts. If your district right now is fully remote and has a transition plan, then it will happen in all likelihood eventually, but likely to still be remote at the beginning of the school year. And there's no way that I can see right now that's mandated in the guidance that school districts have to offer in-person home services, even for home instruction. Before COVID, when a student was on home instruction, the school district would send a tutor or providers to the home or to a library for students to receive services, and that is not the case right now that I can see in COVID. It may be that there could be spaces in a library or in a district office that's private to receive those services, but right now there's no mandate in the home. Okay, so I was just going back to the school district plan. Your school district plan should address the least restrictive environment, and schools under the New York State guidance must consider how your parent voice in making these least restrictive environment decisions is heard. Again, I just stated before that high need students must have priority. Medically fragile students, they can be delivered services on a socially distanced basis. However, it is going to be sort of subject to individual determinations. And one hallmark of every plan should be to ensure meaningful parental engagement. So if you haven't attended meetings that your school district has, please attend them. There should be, in addition to general meetings specifically geared to the needs of students with disabilities. If that's not happening, reach out to your director of special education, reach out to the superintendent, and ask about how to participate and give any concerns that you have. So that's a lot of general background about the school district plan. Any questions as we go through this? Okay. So now we're really going to be turning to your child's specific needs. And again, you really have to, depending on the age of your child, depending on the disability, really take a hard look at how your child has done in the past year, first of all. And if your child's a teenager, talk to them about it. Review the progress or lack of progress from last year. I'm just in the middle of progress for last year, but we did have one question. Just pull it up here. One question came up about how school districts are handling one-to-one aids in the distance learning environment. It's really going to be an individual basis depending on what your child's needs are, but in general, a one-to-one aid is not delivering instruction. If it's a teaching assistant, they are empowered to give some instruction under the supervision of a teacher, but in general, there isn't as much of a need for a one-to-one aid who's going to have to work directly under the supervision of a teacher, and is really there more for safety or health reasons. And there's not from what I saw in the past, there wasn't a need specifically for aides in the distance learning environment. Teaching assistants could be different, but it's really going to be individualized. Some districts in distance learning were allowing the aide to help with communication under the supervision of a teacher. Others were just not having the aide give anything. And really, again, the aides are not empowered to give any instruction. So a teaching assistant could be different. So if you see that your child does need some one-to-one help with learning in the distance learning environment, you may want to ask for a teaching assistant or some one-to-one instruction, because an aide is not going to be the person who is going to be able to do that. And a teaching assistant just has a higher level of credential, and they can actually provide some instruction under New York state law under the supervision of a teacher. So, it's going to be, again, very individualized. But thank you for the question, because that was a dilemma in the certainly in the spring. And school districts, I think, did have a bit of a pass, say from at least March to April, May, even June, because that was the end of the year, to really not have a lot of, just kind of making a lot of things up. They just didn't have a lot of preparation or experience to deliver distance learning. They had to rely on teachers to make up plans, but now there should be a more cohesive and better distance learning plan. In fact, New York State has just received a very significant grant from the federal government on, I think it's 450 hours of professional development for staff. So you should have higher expectations now of your school of delivering better distance learning or remote learning. So I was just in the middle of talking about the first thing to do in focusing on your child, not in the general plan, is to take really a look at your child's progress from that past year. Did your student receive the services that he or she was supposed to receive? And the guidance, again, from the New York State Department of Education and from the federal government is that still, to the maximum extent appropriate, maximum extent possible, rather, not appropriate, to the maximum extent possible, school districts did still have to and do still have to deliver IEP services to students. So if your child was not getting any services, was only getting handed worksheets, and there was no progress, in fact, there was regression, you really should, again, document this, let the district know, and talk about what compensatory or makeup services your child needs. And that is going to be a dialogue. Usually that does require an impartial hearing to receive those services. However, in COVID times, because the state has said specifically that school districts, once they reopen, will be assessing whether a child does need compensatory services, there is a lot more flexibility for school districts to provide compensatory services without a full impartial hearing. But you should still document it very carefully what your child has missed. And it's really not enough that your child who was getting speech language services, was getting OT and PT, just received a worksheet for you to work on. There really should have been some instruction. So just document what your child missed and the regression and seek those compensatory services. If your child has regressed, document this as well. Every child to some degree, I think in the COVID times, did regress. So the benchmark is a little different than it typically is. But for students with disabilities, the needs are even greater, and there is an obligation still on the part of school districts to provide a free, appropriate public education. So again, look at those needs, and if there's been really significant regression and really your child made no progress and really fell behind in everything and also regressed social emotionally, consider whether there has been denial of a free, appropriate public education and whether you do need to initiate an impartial hearing in order to recover compensatory if the district doesn't agree to it, or for a new placement. So just consider that. My colleague Urshi Powell is going to be giving next week on the Lunch and Learn a seminar on the impartial hearing process and just what that entails. And we are doing impartial hearings in COVID times. There are Zoom meetings, Zoom hearings, and there is an opportunity once a parent files to resolve the complaint as well. And she's going to talk about that process. So just consider whether it has been so extreme, that denial, that there has been denial of a free, appropriate public education. Some parents have asked about class actions against the state. Right now, the governor has allowed in-person services. So there could be a basis for a class action. I'm not involved in any and I'm not aware of it, but I think the most effective way to help your child is through the impartial hearing process based on individual needs. Because right now, I think, as I said, the school districts were given some leeway a little bit on the provision of a free, appropriate public education, and any class action would have been against the state on not opening schools, but I think in the middle of the crisis New York had, it would be unlikely to be successful because the closing of the schools at that point was really necessary for public health and safety. So I don't really see that, but that question does come up from time to time. So make sure you have a copy of your child's IEP or 504 plan. And if you don't have a copy, that's very basic, but some parents haven't received their IEPs, their child's IEPs yet, or 504 plans, and make sure you do have that copy because that's the document that controls your student's program. So And remember, even if you haven't received the IEP yet or the 504, it doesn't mean your child has been declassified. It doesn't mean they're not eligible. It just means the district hasn't issued the plan yet. So they're still eligible unless you've received a declassification document. So go through your student's IEP in detail. That's always my first advice, but it's amazing how difficult it can be to take the time to do this. Or some parents just receive it in the mail or an email and just put it aside. But make sure that everything is accurate. As far as the comments, make sure child's name is accurate. Any special alerts are listed. Make sure that all the contact information is accurate. Go through the comment section if there is one in detail and review it. And then turning to the next part of the evaluation section, take a look at what evaluations your student needs. Are there any outstanding evaluations? Students do have to be evaluated under the IDA unless otherwise agreed to every 3 years. If your child's say, for example, a senior in high school and is graduating, you may need some transition planning. So it's important to make sure you do have the evaluations needed for that. And if your child does not have an IEP or a Section 504 plan, it's important to refer your child for services if you think your child needs them. And that can be based on learning needs, it can be based on social emotional needs. But if you think your child's needs have changed from last year, and to the extent that they do have a disability, and that would be under Section 504, physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, or under the IDA, a disability in one of the 13 categories that has an educational impact for which the child needs special education services, then you should refer your child for services. And the referrals are going on in COVID times. Districts have a little bit longer, some flexibility on the 60 school day timeline, but you still should be referring your child if you think there is that need. And reach out for anything and your child's needs have changed. So if your child's needs have changed. So again, review the evaluation section in detail and make sure that the evaluations are listed accurately and make sure there are none missing, and also just make sure that they are current. And if your child hasn't been evaluated in 4 years, make sure you ask for those evaluations. They are going on both in person and as well as remotely. If your district is only doing in-person evaluations and you don't feel comfortable, you can ask for a remote evaluation. It's not going to be possible for all evaluations, but it may be for some. And conversely, if your district is not doing in-person or is not doing remote, and you wish to have, conversely, if your district is not doing in-person and you think your child needs in-person, you can ask for that as well, socially distanced. Okay. So this is an important time, particularly in COVID times, because the IEP does control the program. To take a very careful look at the heart of the IEP. One of the most important parts of the IEP are the present levels of educational achievement and functional performance. They're often just referred to as present levels of performance, but they also cover academic achievement. And they are going to be divided into academics, social emotional needs, physical needs, as well as management needs. And it's very important to review these present levels and make sure that they do reflect your child's state at the time of COVID. Any regression, any changes should be documented here. If the last IEP meeting in the spring there were some points where, for example, you did note there was a change due to COVID or due to isolation, it should be reflected here. If it's not, you could ask for an update. You should ask for an update in a letter. So academics, make sure they are also updated from last year, of course. It's because they have to be updated year to year. And for example, if you look under speech language and your child received no services last year and the IEP says in the area of speech language, the child has made steady progress and that's not true, you should write a letter documenting that, because these should be accurate. And remember, this IEP is going to be controlling. And if you don't document any disagreement, that is going to be standing as his or her record. So if there's any disagreement you have, document it in writing, even small things. It's very important to document. So go through the academic needs, the study skills, reading, writing, math, every area. And then when you get to social development and social emotional development, obviously every student has been isolated to some degree in COVID. So that is unfortunately the norm. I shouldn't say every student, because students in residential settings did have interaction with their peers, but there is likely to be some impact still, because then they wouldn't have seen family, and they wouldn't have had the same opportunities for outside activities. So look through the social development, make sure that reflects the student's current state as well. And any social emotional needs that you see now, you should be documenting to the school district. As I said, every student is isolated now. However, there are signs of, more significant social emotional needs that you should be aware of, and make sure you communicate to your school district. Physical development, make sure you document those needs as well as management needs. Now, the school district should have some guidance on the least restrictive environment and what that looks like for students with disabilities in COVID, and how your voice is being noted in this, whether your child is in a least restrictive environment. So if you have any concerns about that, and on the IEP or just in general for the COVID planning, please make sure that they are documented and you do communicate that to the school district. The least restrictive environment means that to the maximum extent appropriate, that students should have interaction with non-disabled peers and should be progressing in the general curriculum. There's two components to that. So, so if you're not happy with satisfied with that interaction, you're not satisfied with that your child is progressing in the general curriculum to the extent appropriate, then you should communicate that as well. New York school districts tend to be, unfortunately, very stratified and do have a lot of special programs. So there is not, in even typical times, often enough interaction with students with disabilities who are not in, say, integrated co-teach programs or integrated programs and typical peers. So in COVID times, it's even more difficult because of the pods and the cohorts. So to the extent you can, work with the school district on making sure that does still happen, because it is extremely important. And now the next section, looking at whether your child needs behavior intervention. That's one question on the checklist. Does your child need behavior intervention services? And that has been extremely difficult to document, just to address between March to June, because students who have behaviors at home, are not getting the behavior services they are getting in school. The lack of structure has caused a great amount of difficulties, and it's very difficult for parents just to receive, a document on some behavior interventions and to implement it that's not in a school environment. So just to keep that in mind, there may be, again, some compensatory services due to the lack of behavior interventions. And you can now ask for a functional behavior assessment now that the schools are reopening, because I anticipate that a lot of students are going to have difficulty with this hybrid plan. Any questions on that? Because that does come up a lot. And one question I've seen in the past has been, if your child does just show significant behaviors at home, how can you address them in the home environment? And that is where you can seek the help of the school district behaviorist or a school district psychologist on some strategies to use. If your child cannot access the remote learning and access any behavior interventions online, it becomes really up to the parent. And some parents may be able to find private behaviorists to come and work with students in the home. And again, that you could seek reimbursement for that through an impartial hearing or through the process for compensatory services. So that has been a very significant issue that has come up, and this complete lack of structure from March until June, even into the summer, has really caused a lot of behavior aggression on the part of a lot of students. In different ways. So when you're reviewing the management needs, make sure you do note that on the IEP that any regression caused from COVID. Individual needs, if your child has limited English language proficiency, that should be documented in the IEP. Any visual impairment, That should also be listed. On assistive technology should also be listed. If your child needs certain assistive technology to access remote learning, you should let the district know that, and that should be available. So that's getting through the first part of the IEP when really looking at individual needs. Now, the next step I had already had a lot of numbers on the checklist, but I'm already kind of nearing closer to the end on 23. Reviewing the goals on the IEP. It's very important to take a hard look at these goals, make sure that they are, we call them SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and timely. And in addition to being achievable, they should not be repeated from last year because that really shows a lack of progress. Even if the district said, well, we didn't get to address this in COVID, that's really evidence that the student didn't get the services they needed. So review the goals in detail, make sure they meet those criteria, and check them to the extent you have the IEP last year, check them against that to make sure that they're not exactly the same, because that is, again, a hallmark of a lack of progress or an indicia. If there are new goals you think your student needs, you should write to the district and write to the special education director, ask for either a meeting or at least an amendment, no meeting, to at least consider new goals. Now, the next section on the IEP, of course, is the program, and that is, for many parents and students, that's the meat of the IEP. So look at that program. Make sure, again, looking back at your district plan, looking back at the schedule, that you know exactly how that's going to be delivered. So if that is an 8 to 1-to-1 class, make sure you understand if your child is meeting every day, where it's going to meet, how your child is going to be transported there. What are the protocol for social distancing? Again, they will still have to be socially distanced and wearing masks. There are going to be mask breaks allowed. And if it's partly remote, how are the students going to be accessing the remote? Many districts did not have synchronous learning last year and found it did not work for many students. Is your district going to providing synchronous learning or asynchronous learning? And make sure you know that. That should be listed in your plan to some degree. And make sure if your child is in grades 7 to 12 and they are going to be progressing on even not in the Regents track, just in general for academics, they should be receiving, there's a minimum of 180 minutes per week for each unit of study to 7 to 12. So make sure there is sufficient instruction for each child. That's not really that much time. It's 3 hours of instruction per subject. And, obviously students do receive more than that, but that's the actual minimum that the state requires under regulations. Make sure you know how the related services are going to be provided on the IEP if there are any. And if there's counseling, that can often be done remotely. If there's speech language therapy, make sure it's actual speech language therapy, which can be delivered either in person or remotely. PT and OT in general, there are some protocols for, I think, remote services. However, they are much less effective. And if your child needs those in-person services, make sure there is a means to receive those, because the state, again, has stated that students with disabilities should be given the highest priority for the in-person services. Now, the next section in times of COVID of the IEP, which is on supplementary aids, services, and modifications, is extremely important to take a look at. Often this gets short shrift in the IEP meetings, but you should really be reviewing the supplementary aid services and program modifications in detail. And to the extent your child cannot access the remote learning, this is the place this should be listed, and there can be also listed a remote instruction plan. We have recommended developing for each child a remote instruction plan, and to the extent your child does need individual accommodations for distance learning. Or if your student cannot access distant learning, that can be listed there as well. So it's very important to note that and go through these modifications in detail, make sure they are sufficient, and make sure they do address your students' needs. No districts on their own have come up with remote instruction plans, but we're recommending that parents, through with their providers and with, as well as even through their own observations, do develop some kind of remote instruction plan to assist their children, and provide it to the school district for consideration and to document that this is what needed. This is what is needed. It's best to do that with some kind of professional as well. But I think you could send it to your district and say, this is what we have observed in my student's private therapist has recommended, or ABA provider, and to the extent this is not possible, please let us know. Because it could, in general, help district as well, and that could either be listed on the IEP or incorporated into the IEP. It could be, but if it were listed, it'd be listed into this, the section on accommodations and modifications. So, any questions as we move forward? Anything else? On to now, make sure when you look at the IEP, make sure if your student is receiving a 12-month program that it is listed here. Some districts in the spring programming will not list the 12-month because they will wait till the next year. But in general, if your child has had it every year, it should be still listed here. Look at the testing accommodations, what testing is needed for your student. Now, make sure you pay attention next to the section on participation in state and district-wide assessments, and that you agree with that. If a student is on alternate assessment, make sure you understand the reasons and make sure you understand what that means, that the district has to explain to you. That means your child will not be able to receive a New York State diploma. And it's very hard once that's designated to often get off that designation, because the curriculum does get more rigorous every year. And in general, almost all students, except for the sort of the 1% in the state, should be on the general education, should be receiving general education access and being able to work toward a high school diploma. So make sure you do agree with that statement of participation in state or district-wide assessments. And next, going to the least restrictive environment. Make sure that you do understand how that's going to be offered in COVID, and make sure that your voice is documented on the IEP. It might not be here in this section because it's just a check mark, but it should be done in the comments. And then next is transportation. Make sure you review the transportation guidelines in your school district plan. Students will be transported to school to the extent there is in-person learning in COVID, and they have to be socially distanced on the bus. So it is going to be a challenge. There are specific rules for bus drivers to make sure students wear masks. They have to document any lack of compliance with this. Students have to be socially distanced unless they're siblings and they can sit together. So there's a lot of work for the bus driver to do. I anticipate it might mean that school districts, the busing could even take longer, which is even more of a challenge. The guidance also suggests from the state, and with some districts are saying that to the extent possible, encourage parents to drive their students to school. If you can do that, it's probably best to do that, but not every parent can do that. So that's a very significant aspect of the special education program, and make sure that you are comfortable with the transportation provided. Make sure you communicate with the district. Now, if you believe your child should not be attending school in this hybrid environment, it's going to be too stressful. Many districts do allow the option for solely remote learning, and you do have the right to request that. And in the past, it was really required that you have some medical documentation, but in general, many districts in the state has given, I believe, from what I can see, it's hard to tell, some clearance for fully remote option. Because it's certainly given school districts right to be fully remote. So there's no reason that if a student has, just even if they don't have specific medical needs requiring the fully remote, there is the fully remote option. And that's not really recommended for every student just because of the social isolation, but it is an option. And if the only downside, as I noted, is that students in that situation are not going to be getting the in-person services, and there's no mandate that they receive them at home from individual providers. So I went through a lot. We went through, first looking at general back to school preparation, making sure you get ready for school with an optimistic note. Then went through looking at your school district plan. We then looked through looking at the plan for students with disabilities, in general from your school district, and then looking at your students' individual needs, focusing on the IEP and focusing on specific services needed. So that's really the checklist of getting ready. This is not easy for anyone. Nothing is certain. But if there are any questions, please let me know. And in addition, please tune in for Urshi Powell's presentation next week on the impartial hearing process in general, what that looks like and how it progresses, both in times of COVID and otherwise. So if there are other questions, I will take them now. Otherwise, we can sign off, and please stay in touch. And we wish all a positive back to school time. And again, your child will follow your lead, so it's best to be as optimistic as possible in these very difficult times. I wish everyone good health and a very successful school year. So I don't believe there are questions. So we can sign off now, and wishing you all the best. Okay.